The next section we're going to talk about is planes of motion, and there are three basic imaginary planes that pass through the body, okay? You've got your sagittal plane that divides the body or structure into right and left halves in terms of sides. And so imagine the sagittal plane is cutting through your body like this, okay? And motion is going to go through that plane. How I teach people to remember that is, you think about when people go to the gym, they usually go because they're sagging this way and they're sagging that way. So that's a real easy way to remember that. Sagittal plane cuts through the middle of the body, divides us into right and left halves, but motion goes through that plane. It's not going to where it divides it, it's going where it actually cuts you in half. As opposed to the frontal or coronal plane, divides the body or structure into anterior and posterior portions, okay? So there's those anatomical terms coming back, anterior versus posterior. So we know if it's going to be a frontal, it's going to cut us this way, separating us from anterior versus posterior portions. So motion is going to go through this plane of motion right here, through our frontal plane. So you have like abduction and adduction of the arm, shoulder, abduction and adduction of the hip as well. Versus our transverse plane, our third imaginary plane through the body, also known as our horizontal plane, divides the body or structure into superior and inferior sections. So there once again is those terms coming back to be a part of an explanation for these other terms. And so it's important we build a foundation one after another. So the transverse plane is going to cut us through this direction, okay? And it's going to be motion through this horizontal. Like on a bench press, we got horizontal adduction is towards the midline, AB is away, okay? And we'll go over those terms here in a second. So be familiar with these three basic terms. You have your axis of rotation, which is kind of another example of how planes of motion occur. Just basically be familiar with your x-axis, which is your coronal axis, which is your medial and lateral plane of motion. Your y-axis or vertical axis, which is going to be your superior and inferior going up and down. And your z-axis, which is anterior posterior, okay? So basically you can see that z is going anterior versus posterior, y is superior versus inferior, and x is medial, meaning towards the middle, versus lateral on either side, okay? So be familiar with those three terms in terms of axis or rotation. Center of mass. The center of mass is the mean location of all the mass in a system. As the human body moves, this point is constantly changing. So depending on how a person lifts, if I broaden my stance, for example, I change the center of mass, okay? So you got to think about that in terms of how you're bending. In this example, you have like a stiff-legged deadlift. If I was to keep the center of mass with my body holding a dumbbell, I wouldn't want to go out this way because that could make me almost fall over. I want to keep the center of mass over my ankles. So I would push the hips back, keeping the dumbbell here, and I would still keep the center of mass right in the middle of my body. So you have to look at that in terms of levers. And in some instances, this point is found outside of the body. It can vary depending on how you stand and so forth. So those are things you need to be generally familiar with. All right, joint motion. Those are things I just kind of hit on just a second ago. You need to think of these terms in terms of angles of joints, not in terms of muscles, okay? So when we use the term flexion, and that is a movement resulting in a decrease of a joint angle. So when we're talking about the elbow joint, I'm not talking about my bicep flexing, I'm talking about simply my elbow bending, so I could passively bend it too. I'm not necessarily flexing my bicep. But when this elbow joint decreases the angle here, we call that flexing the elbow, okay? Same thing with the knee joint. If I take my knee and I bend it, I decrease the angle right here, that is going to be flexion of the knee. As opposed to extension is resulting in an increase of the joint angle. So referencing the elbow, if I was to extend my elbow, okay, I just increased this angle right here. So that would be extension, okay? Same thing on flexion and extension. If I was to take my torso, my trunk, and I was to flex my spine, okay, using the anterior portion, which is your anatomical reference, okay, I'm going to talk about this side of my spine. I'm decreasing the angle of the vertebrae on this side of my spine versus extension as I'm increasing, okay? And then when we talk about, because we're referencing from the anatomical position, which is this up right here, if I go beyond the neutral extension, which in this case we had flexion of the spine, extension of the spine, and let me do a profile here. Flexion of the spine, extension of the spine, hyperextension, okay, because I went beyond the anatomical position, which on the profile would look like so. So that is not, a lot of times we think of hyperextension like you've hyperextended an elbow, like you've dislocated it. And then when we're talking about hyperextension in this regard, it is not the exact same thing. It's in terms of anatomical position. You can also do the same thing with your neck. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Lateral flexion, which is another type of flexion, okay? So if we're flexing this side, we're extending this side. If we're flexing this side, we're extending this side. So those are other ways to do that. Then you have abduction or abduction, which is movement away from the midline of the body. So when I'm talking about my arms here, if I'm going to raise my arms to the side, I'm going, here's my midline. Once again, you got to know those reference points. This is going away. I'm AB away. So if you do like a side lateral with the dumbbells, I'm abducting away. Versus adduction is when I'm pulling into my body. Okay, I'm adding towards my midline is how I remember that. Same thing with the hip. AB away, AD2. You can use those on your hip and your shoulders. Well, what do you do when you're talking about, toward the midline, but you're not in this plane of motion? Well, that's why we have that horizontal plane of motion going across this way, okay? Which we look back here earlier, we had the transverse plane or horizontal plane, is AKA the horizontal plane. So here it is talking about going along this line right here, which is right here. And so imagine like through your shoulder, this transverse plane or also horizontal plane is coming back into play right here because we're talking about horizontal adduction going towards the midline, horizontal abduction going away from the midline in that reference. Then you have internal rotation, which is rotation in the transverse plane toward the midline of the body. Okay, so like if I'm looking at my humerus or my arm bone and I'm rotating in here, and really I'm not even so much looking at this forearm, but I'm watching this humerus rotate medially. Okay, if I'm taking my hip and I'm rotating my femur internally, that is an example of medial rotation. How are we doing on there?